now to one with Ian Shanahan of Green Teacher, which I believe, is that based out of Canada?
Yes, we are on the north shore of Lake Ontario. So for anyone who's been to the Northeast, we're right across from Rochester, New York, which we can actually see on very clear nights right across Lake Ontario.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've attended a couple different trainings through Green Teacher, including one on teaching about climate change with Ian. And I was like, we need to get you for our teacher training. And he was more than willing to engage. So I will just mention to you, Ian. So we set up a couple of breakout rooms for later in the day. I'm wondering, we might be able to potentially use them or just kind of explain more how you'd want to do them. Because I know that a couple people, yeah, like I'm not sure, right now they don't have their like grade levels, listed, and the groupings that we have for later are either multi-grade level or like elementary, middle, high school. So you can just kind of explain to us how you'd like us to go about that when the time comes.
Yeah, I even have a slide that lists it for the more visually inclined, so we'll be all set.
Great, so you can take it away.
All right, very good. Well, this is so fitting to follow up a nature journaling session. I just wrote in the chat box there that sort of my winter weekend activity has been nature sketching, primarily birds and mammals up on the ice. And very recently, I've been focusing a lot on ducks because a lot of the ducks that spend the winter in Chesapeake Bay out around Delaware and North Carolina are now coming through the Great Lakes region. So it's a bevy of waterfowl coming through, and they're very forgiving subjects to sketch, because if you're looking at something like a scaup or a redhead and one dives underwater, there's 550 more of them right beside it, so you can always find another subject. So yeah, it's very fitting. I don't know if you planned that on purpose, but it all lined up nicely. So I'll get into the bulk of the presentation. I've got a PowerPoint and we'll jump into that very shortly, but I first just want to get a sense of barriers to teaching climate change that you have experienced. And that can be anything from pushback you've received from students or from their parents. That could be lack of resources. It could be how up-to-date resources are. So just write in the chat box so that I can get a general sense of kind of what you're up against and what gaps you are looking to fill. And that will help me gear what I'm going to be talking about here towards your specific needs. So yeah, just take a couple minutes, add your ideas there, and that'll also give each of us a nice sense of where everyone is at and what they're up against. I promise this will not be a doom and gloom based discussion. In fact, that's one of the core ideas, is not to be doom and gloom and how to go about doing that. So just a little disclaimer at the beginning. Yeah, so some parents saying that it's not in the curriculum or it's not a priority. So that's definitely a big issue. I mean, I'm based in Canada, and of our 13 provinces / territories, less than half of them have climate change as a priority in the curriculum. The way it is set up in Canada is each province or territory does have its own curriculum. So what's happening in Ontario might be very different from what's happening in BC or Alberta or Yukon or Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, and so on and so forth. One other disadvantage that we have up here in Canada is that we don't have an umbrella conceptual framework like the Next Generation Science Standards. I've gotten to be quite familiar with those through my work with Green Teacher, because we're partnering with so many organizations and schools in the United States. So I know that's a great resource in the US, and my understanding is more than 30 states, upwards of 35, have now at least unofficially adopted the NGSS. So that's definitely a big thing. Parents saying that it's not a priority, that's maybe something that we can unpack a bit here, and you can again add into the chat box why you think that might be. Why would a parent say to their student, well, climate change isn't a priority, or at a parent-teacher meeting, the topic comes up and they're like, it's not a priority, I'm not really interested in that being taught to my children. Why is that? So this is something we're certainly familiar with, is that anti-science and anti-education, and I'll add on top of that just anti-intelligence sentiment that is out there. Politics, of course, depending on which province you are in Canada, depending on which industry people are working for, this can be a big one. No question about that. And we are going to dig into that. No pun intended, but we are going to dig into that a little bit later. I'll just wait another minute or two here just to see if anyone wants to share any other barriers or challenges to teaching climate change. I'm also interested in, what do you have in terms of resources? Do you feel that you have enough resources, or maybe not enough? What are the specific gaps? Are there more gaps with certain age groups than others? Yeah, lack of time, that's one that comes up a lot whenever I do this presentation or various iterations of it, is yeah, the lack of time and the lack of knowledge. Now, I consider myself a bit of a climate change geek. This is a small snippet of some of the books on my climate change shelf. You've probably read a good number of these. There's Don't Even Think About It by George Marshall. I don't work for any of these publishing companies, I promise. Merchants of Doubt is a really good one, specifically looking at how doubt was sown in the tobacco industry and how that has been applied to climate change. This is a fairly new one by an Australian author, Rebecca Huntley, How to Talk About Climate Change. The Drawdown book. This is based out of California. You might be familiar with drawdown.org. We'll talk about them very soon. It takes a lot of time to read those books. You might have to take the whole summer just to read all of these books. And as I say, that's just a very small snippet. I haven't even gotten into Tim Flannery and the Weathermakers, or Jared Diamond and Collapse, and on and on and on and on and on. So the crux of what we're going to be talking about in today's session are based around these two workbooks that Green Teacher has. And Green Teacher is a nonprofit, so all proceeds for sales of these workbooks do go back into the nonprofit and help us enhance environmental literacy among learners. Most of our operations are focused in North America, but we've been expanding quite a bit overseas, but more on that later. Really, the goal of this session is to prioritize the knowledge about climate change and the effective and high impact strategies for teaching about it into digestible pieces, so that you don't, for example, have to spend your entire summer reading so many books to become climate literate. Teachers are always short on time, I think especially now with the pandemic and the combination of virtual teaching and hybrid teaching. So ready to use workbooks with ready to use lesson plans are perhaps at more of a premium now than they ever have been. And as Ryan's just put in the chat box, each of you received a book from Green Teacher in the materials for the training, one of our other publications. So thank you everyone so far for sharing your challenges. We will certainly speak to all of those and more over the course of the presentation. So now for the PowerPoint part, and I promise not to bore you with death by PowerPoint, but here we go. I will share my screen. So how and why to teach about climate change? Again, much of this is based on our two climate change workbooks, and the plan is for this to be interactive, for this to be hands-on, and to be solutions oriented. Just quickly, a land acknowledgement. I mentioned I was based on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. This is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples, and this area is covered by the Williams Treaty. You can find more at native-land.ca to find out about the traditional territories or the traditional peoples from the area where you are based. So the plan for this session, we'll first talk about the why. I know the title is how and why because that trips off the tongue a little easier than why and how, but we will start with the why, as naturally I think that is a sensible place to start. We will then get into the how, and I've split this up into two categories. Broadly speaking, kids, With that, we will be in particular looking at systems thinking and kinesthetic learning as a way to create a positive association with climate change, because the first version of this presentation that I did, that Ryan attended back in January, I started with word association, or technically for the grammatically inclined among us, phrase association. When you say climate change, what emotion do you feel? And as you can imagine, many negative emotions were shared. So we'll be looking at positive associations through systems thinking and kinesthetic learning for teaching kids about climate change. When we get into the how aspect for teens, we'll be looking more at youth empowerment and measurable local change. So things that you can actually see and do that make youths and teens feel more empowered. We will then follow this up with a small group activity that will involve going into the breakout rooms briefly, sharing some experiences, coming back for a follow-up, and then we will end off with a final Q&A, time permitting. I'll make sure that, that we don't go over time here. So beginning with the why. If you've had the opportunity to read the IPCC report, it's very long, it's very in-depth. There are more abbreviated versions of it, but you've probably seen some of the core takeaways, such as the balance of evidence suggests that there's a discernible human influence on global climate. 97.1% of climate scientists agree on this fact. You'll note that that quotation was from 1996. The attention was starting to be paid to climate change in the early 1980s, even the late 1970s. So this has been something that's been on the radar for quite some time. And then of course, most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is attributable to human activities, and all these sorts of quotations you can see on the IPCC website. The big report came out in October of 2018, and subsequent reports have come out just detailing other paths forward. I mentioned about Project Drawdown, and there is the book Drawdown, which, as it's titled, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, to draw down the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And they have ranked 100 solutions based on the number of gigatons of CO2 or CO2 equivalents that can be drawn down or reduced from the atmosphere. So it's very much quantified. It's one of the biggest collective efforts in recent memory with regards to climate change, apart from the IPCC. I highly recommend at least checking out the website or checking out the book as well. And how is this relevant to our discussion today? Well, if you look at their rankings, and you'll see on the right-hand side there, scenario 1, those are our Paris targets from 2015, the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature from pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. Scenario 2 is 2 degrees. 2 degrees at this point is looking more realistic than 1.5 degrees, but 1.5 is still possible. We are in about year 3 of the 12-year window that the IPCC outlined in October of 2018. So the clock is ticking, but we do still have some time, about 9 years. But again, getting back to these rankings, take a look, it's right near the top, just underneath reduced food waste. It's health and education. And if you break that down even further, and you can see the quantified number, 85.42 gigatons of CO2 equivalent reduced or sequestered between 2020 and 2050. The focus on this is not just education in general, but it's educating girls, educating young women so that they can be more socially mobile, so that they can make more effective decisions and more climate responsible decisions, and so that they can have more agency in their lives. And this is a real eye-opener to a lot of people. They often think that the top solutions are going to be renewable energy technologies, and of course those are critical and those are high on the list, but education, according to Project Drawdown, is ranked incredibly high on the list, and that's just additional justification for why we do need to act fast through education. Before we jump into the how, I want to tell you a bit of a story. Ryan has already heard this story, so no spoilers. But I'd like to start this story off with a question. Always good to start off with a bit of a hook. What's the big deal about some bird poop? You're thinking, what kind of tangent is this guy going off of? What is in the water in Lake Ontario? Well, we will find out very soon. So this is a true story. It's not based on a true story. It is very much a true story. And so we'll go all the way back to August 29th of 2003. And this was 2 weeks after an incredible stargazing night on August 14th. So I know Ryan is also a fellow Northeasterner, and she probably remembers August 14th, 2003, when there was a massive power outage. And for those who were not put at any danger because of the power outage, it was pretty awesome, I have to admit. I was supposed to do a PowerPoint presentation, actually a slideshow presentation with a proper slide deck about nocturnal life. And because the power had gone out, I was not able to use the projector, but people still showed up. And I was like, well, I can't do the slideshow, but this is the best stargazing we might ever have. So we got star charts, we went out and we looked at the stars, and the Big Dipper was amazing, and we all just had a great time. So 2 weeks after that, it was near the end of the summer and just finishing up my summer contract at my local provincial park. And something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye, and I just took off mid-conversation. I had been talking to one of my supervisors, not advised to just suddenly take off mid-sentence and run away. And I was really running. I probably could have kept up with Usain Bolt for the first few steps. What was I running after? I was running after this. This is a giant swallowtail. It's the largest butterfly in Canada and one of the largest ones in North America. And I managed to actually catch it. I had a butterfly net in my hand, which was quite fortuitous, and I was able to catch it. And voila, on August 29th, 2003, the first record of giant swallowtail at this local provincial park where I was working. Fast forward 17 years, 18 years later, and giant swallowtails are now a regular breeding species. They actually have two broods, a spring brood and a late summer brood, and they're just a normal part of the fauna in southern Ontario. So getting back to this big question, what's the big deal about some bird poop? Well, let's zoom in. This is not regular bird poop. If you look a little bit closer, and this was a picture from June 10th, 2012, I don't know if I've ever seen bird poop with appendages. If you look very closely, there are small appendages. This, in fact, is not bird poop. This is a giant swallowtail caterpillar feeding on prickly ash, which is its larval food plant. June 10th, 2012, quite a while after 2003. By that time, giant swallowtail was well established in southern Ontario. Why is that? Largely because of the warming trend, because of climate change. And we've certainly seen this trend with many species, red-bellied woodpeckers and other species in the Northeast, that went from being quite uncommon in southern Ontario to now as well being a regular breeder. Who doesn't like a butterfly? Who doesn't like a good story? I'm into creating a positive association, which will hopefully connect to larger concepts, and we will get to that very soon. This story of the giant swallowtail is a climate change story that is not steeped in doom and gloom, and that's a big part of my focus today, and a big part of our focus with our Green Teacher workshops is not to burden particularly young minds with the doom and the gloom. So we'll walk through a few activities here, starting with a couple activities for kids and then a couple activities for teens. And this is all going to be part of the how aspect of the presentation. So not recommended to give the IPCC report to kids, that goes without saying. They're not going to pay attention to what 1.5 degrees Celsius means. This is for you to read for background information, but for young minds less than 10 years old, it's not going to be effective. For those who are familiar with David Sobel's work, he's written a lot about place-based learning, but one of his famous quotations is no tragedies before 4th grade. So in and around 9 years old, you don't want to burden them too much. I remember when I was in 3rd grade, about 8 years old, and I first learned about global warming. And I didn't learn about it as this big problem that was going to sink the city of Miami. I learned about it just in terms of the science of how a greenhouse works. And I had a much more positive association because I thought, hey, that's interesting, that's cool. So no tragedies before fourth grade, a good guiding principle to follow. You could enter into a discussion with kids about climate change with a story about butterflies. If it's a true story, all the better. I don't believe giant swallowtails are found too often in Oregon, although you never know what way the wind is going to blow. But of course, there are other local butterfly species such as lorquins, admirals, and the various other species of the beautiful Pacific Northwest, one of my favorite parts of North America. So with kids, we really do want to focus on those positive associations. And part of this can lead into systems thinking, which is a concept that I'm sure many of you are familiar with and that is gaining a lot of steam, which I think is for the benefit of all educators and all learners. This particular activity based on systems thinking is titled with this fairly provocative title, Is Climate Change Good for Us? Well, I have to admit, if you were to look at my giant swallowtail story in a vacuum, there is something positive to that. I'm very happy that I get to see giant swallowtails on a regular basis, and many other people are as well. They're big, they're beautiful, magnificent. That's something positive that no one can take away. This is another discussion that comes up with ash trees. I'm not sure if is the emerald ash borer infestation affecting the Pacific Northwest as well, or is that more central and east?
I'm not sure. I know it was in Vermont.
Yeah, so if you're not sure, it probably hasn't impacted the West, which is great. So yes, the various species of ash trees are really getting hammered by the emerald ash borer, a non-native invasive species from Asia. And on one hand, the ash trees are dying, but on the other hand, for people who like woodpeckers and like sketching or taking pictures of woodpeckers, it's fantastic. There are legitimate positive associations that can't be ignored. However, there's more to it than that, and this is where the systems thinking comes in. Starting with young children, a fairly straightforward activity sheet that you can look at is a series of different potential impacts of climate change. And you don't have to get as specific as you would in something like the drawdown book. You can go with simple concepts like more rainstorms or more snowstorms, less rainfall or snowfall, more sunshine, less sunshine, and so on, what you can see on this list. So on one hand, how would it affect me? Warmer temperatures, prickly ash, the shrub, is expanding its range farther north. Therefore, more giant swallowtail caterpillars have more larval food plants to feed on. How does that affect me? Well, I get to see more giant swallowtails and take pictures, and I like that. How would it affect things around me? Maybe not as obvious with the giant swallowtail question, but when you get into some of the weather impacts, it is a bit more obvious. More rainstorms or snowstorms. Some people love snow. We didn't have a lot of snow in southern Ontario this winter, and some people were very disappointed. They said, I bought these new snowshoes and didn't even have to use them. So how would more snowfall affect you? Well, hey, that's great. I get to use my snowshoes more. What about more rainstorms? How does that affect you? Well, if you like the rain, great. If you don't like the rain, not so great. If you have flooding, like we have had on Lake Ontario in 2 of the last 4 years, how would that affect things around me? Well, the number of houses in my community right on Lake Ontario that had to put barriers of sandbags up to prevent flooding, that was a major problem. People who had flooded basements and insurance problems, that was a major problem. Now, kids might not be interested in talking about insurance, but they can certainly relate to the idea of putting up sandbags and seeing backyards being flooded, parking lots being flooded, or go on a walk. And this is a true story from 2017 and 2019, seeing various species of fish spawning on walking trails that are usually dry. Those are impacts that any young kid can see. And if you are seeing a carp rolling around on a familiar walking or biking path, you are not going to forget that. So this is a really neat little avenue into systems thinking, but starting with a positive association. Higher wind speeds, of course, you can get kids to think about, what if more branches fell off trees and fell on cars? Bring in some pictures of tree branches that have gone through the windows of cars, and it becomes much more relatable to kids. And you can extend this as well by getting kids to think of more examples, types of impacts of climate change, and how would it affect them? How would it affect things around them? They can do it as groups. They can do it as individuals. You can do a follow-up activity. You can get a pretty robust discussion going, even with very young kids, just by asking that question, is climate change good for us? Well, on one hand, it might be, I might like it, but what are the impacts of things around me? It's more than just me, it's the systems around me. Continuing with the theme of positive associations, kinesthetic learning. So we certainly know that kids love to get outside, they love to use their bodies, and I would say for all of us who've been chained to our computers doing Zoom teaching and hybrid teaching, I think a lot of big kids like the kinesthetic learning and getting outside as well. And as soon as our vaccine rollout really ramps up, I think we're going to see a boomerang effect, I hope so, of people really getting outside and enjoying their bodies and using their bodies to explore all the wonderful places that they've perhaps not been able to explore as much over the last year and a half. So this activity, the carbon dioxide game, is a way to learn about a system and a cycle that gets kids competing, moving around, and thinking. So how does the carbon dioxide game work? Let's just walk through it. You can get a general idea there just from the picture, but we'll walk through the specific instructions. So what you want to do is draw 2 concentric circles on the ground. Really, it depends on the size of your class, but generally speaking, a 1 meter diameter inside a 5 meter diameter. Sorry for the metric reference here. Approximately 3 feet by 15 feet. So these 2 concentric circles, what do they represent? Well, the concentric circle in the middle, this represents the Earth, and the concentric circle on the outside represents the Earth's atmosphere. And you can do this in a couple different rounds. So round 1, you have 2 static students who represent CO2 molecules. And then all the rest of the students represent sunbeams. So what do the sunbeams have to do? Well, the sunbeams have to enter from outside the outer circle, and they have to tag the smaller circle on the inside. They have to tag the Earth and then escape the atmosphere without getting tagged by one of the CO2 molecules. Now remember, the CO2 molecules are fixed. They can't run around, at least not at the beginning. 2 CO2 molecules and say 20 sunbeams, most of your sunbeams will hopefully be able to enter the Earth's atmosphere, touch the Earth, and exit the Earth's atmosphere without getting tagged by a CO2 molecule. However, there's another aspect to this. Your "what did humans do" cards. Here are some examples, and you can certainly make your own and get creative with this, but one example, humans drive cars. For some specific learning, a little fact: every liter of gas puts 2.35 kilograms of CO2 into the atmosphere, or 18.8 pounds per US gallon. So once you draw the humans drive cars action card, you add 2 more CO2 molecules and repeat the activity again, round 2. Get all your sunbeam children to go inside the atmosphere, try to touch the Earth, and try to avoid the now 4 CO2 molecules. Well, what if you pick up the next card? Humans drive more cars, 2 more CO2 molecules. Now it's getting a lot more difficult for those sunbeam kids to touch the Earth and exit the Earth's atmosphere. You can probably see where this is going. The more "what did humans do" action cards you draw, the more carbon dioxide molecules you have in the Earth's atmosphere, the more difficult it is for your sunbeam children to touch the Earth and exit the atmosphere without getting touched by a carbon dioxide molecule. And in the process of tagging each other and competing and running around and laughing and perhaps falling on the grass and getting a grass stain, they have accidentally perhaps learned how the carbon cycle works, at least at a basic level. And again, you can have a positive association, maybe not through a story, maybe not through looking at a positive individual impact of climate change, but just through having fun learning about climate change. Imagine that. It is very possible. Moving on to the how for teens, and I should have looked over this slide beforehand. That should say teens instead of kids, but I guess in some respect they're all kids in a way. But specifically with teens, and this is all based on our Teaching Teens About Climate Change workbook, I want to focus here on empowering youth voices. You're starting to get students who are wanting to take matters into their own hands, take a leadership role, take an active role in their learning, in their path in life, and hey, why not harness that? One way you can do that is through an activity like this game. Now, this is a game, it's a board game. Anybody out there like playing Risk or Settlers of Catan? Really good for rainy days. This is a game kind of structured in the same way, and it's about to go to market fairly soon. It's a gentleman based in Nova Scotia who's working in partnership with Project Drawdown in California. And the game is based on Project Drawdown, and it's all based on solutions. And the name of the game is Solutions. So really looking at solutions-oriented thinking for the sake of empowering youth voices. It's suitable for middle and high school students, but he has sent some demo copies out to even younger students and has received very positive feedback about that. So that's something to keep an eye out for, Solutions the Game. It'll be a great educational resource available very soon. Continuing on this theme of solutions-oriented thinking for the sake of youth empowerment, we go to our Teaching Kids About Climate Change, or Teaching Teens About Climate Change book, and this activity, Teaching About Carbon Regulation. What are some real-life solutions that exist and are being used right now in the world, right now in North America? Well, this activity is all based around examining different carbon regulations and different regulations with regards to decarboning the economy. So there are three different options that are looked at in this activity. One is command and control, a very top-down approach where you're told this is what you're allowed to do and that's it. There's no negotiation, there's no flexibility. It's very much a sledgehammer approach. Option number two is something we're seeing in many jurisdictions. We're seeing this in many different countries in the world. We're seeing this adopted in many states and many provinces in Canada, the carbon tax. And most economists agree that putting a price on carbon is one of the, if not the most effective impact that you can have on drawing down carbon in our economy. Make it work within a regulated capitalist system. And then sort of an offshoot of that is the cap and trade system. If you're not able to fit within the cap, there's a bit of flexibility. And if you go over the cap, you can buy credits from organizations that go under the cap. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with cap and trade, and you can certainly read lots about it. Tons and tons of articles, tons and tons of books, activities, all about how cap and trade works. So how does this activity work? You're going to be looking at those three potential solutions, and the teacher, the educator, their role is going to be the fictitious North American Greenhouse Gas Initiative. NAGGI, sounds official, sounds realistic enough. So that's the teacher's role. Then a couple students who perhaps you want to put into a leadership role. You're going to have two carbon brokers. Start with two students. You can go a little bit above that, that's fine. And then you're going to have 6 different groups, 2 to 5 students per group. So this is the remainder of the students in the class. They will each group will represent a different utility company. So here's an example of one of the aforementioned utility companies. So this one is the Ontario Electric Power Company. And you can see a whole bunch of information about what their carbon emissions are. And then if you look about halfway down the page, you can see how their carbon emissions would be impacted, but also how their bottom line would be impacted by some of these different scenarios. How would a command and control regulation impact this organization? How would a cap and trade regulation impact this organization? Going down even further, what are the credits and offsets? Looking at this information, each group has to look at which of the 3 solutions is going to be most effective for them. And in the process of that, they're going to be considering the economics of the company, and they're also going to be considering their emissions. They have to go to the carbon brokers, and they have to present which idea they think is going to be the most effective to them. The carbon brokers can negotiate with them, and then the teacher gets the final say. In the process of doing this, the goal really isn't necessarily to compete and win per se. It's to discuss how does this solution impact us financially? How does this solution impact our emissions? If we are forced to create generators based on renewable energy, what's going to be the economic consequence of that in a 6-month time frame, in a 5-year time frame? At what point is this going to be paid back? Does our company have the capital to invest upfront for something that's not going to pay off for another 5 years? So you can get really in depth with the math of this, and you can start charting and creating graphs and really produce hard data that you can examine with your students, all in the process of having the students discuss the different solutions, negotiate with the brokers, and then have the final consultation with their teacher. They can specifically quantify their CO2 emissions reductions as well as the cost with worksheets, and these are included in the book. Again, based on the command and control, the carbon tax, and the cap and trade. And again, this is where the teacher can oversee and kind of help them along with this and ask those probing questions in case they're stuck on a concept or maybe haven't considered a really important aspect, such as upfront costs. And in addition to empowering youth and teen voices through looking at solutions, why not look at measurable local change that they can actually do? That first activity was a fictitious hypothetical activity. It never hurts to do something that's very much real. And this is based on an activity called the Car Trip Reduction Plan for Schools, going off ramp. And this is where students actually create a plan for their school to reduce the number of cars coming to their school at least 1 day a week. Now, it doesn't have to be limited to 1 day a week. That's what's suggested in the book in this activity, but it can be car-free month, it could be car-free week, car-free Tuesdays and Thursdays, car-free Mondays and Fridays. There are lots of different iterations of this that you can use. Now, each school has different challenges. If you're in a more rural location and distances are farther and bus access is limited, those are all important aspects of the discussion, and that ties again into systems thinking and looking at transportation infrastructure. If you're in a more urban setting, you can look at the options for using public transit. This is a great opportunity for students to connect with the community. What does it cost students to use transit? What does a weekly pass cost? What does a monthly plan cost? What is the time commitment of using a transit route? What about people who live on the west side of town, on the east side of town? What is going to be the impact of having fewer cars in the parking lot from a health and safety standpoint, especially if you have younger students who also go to this school, if you have high school and elementary school combined together? So lots of different aspects of this. And you can get, as an example, you can get your students into groups. They each create a plan, and perhaps you vote on the plan that you think will be most effective overall, a line of best fit that takes into account number of car trips reduced, health and safety, cost, time commitment, present it to the school. It can be something that the school administration can galvanize behind, and this can become something really exciting to do. Of course, we've got Earth Month / week / Earth Day coming up. This could be the kind of thing that would be great to pilot on Earth Day. Although, as we hear very rightfully around Earth Day, every day is Earth Day, so maybe pilot it on Earth Day and really ramp it up and get it going to start the next school year in September. A good way to start this is by putting out a basic student survey just to get a sense of the transportation habits of students and their guardians in a school. And again, all of this is in the workbook, and this can all be adapted and created to suit your individual context. So that's kind of a rapid fire brief overview of 2 activities for kids and 2 activities for teaching teens that involve positive associations through things like systems thinking, youth empowerment, kinesthetic learning, solutions-oriented thinking. I'd like to go back to the question that I asked at the beginning and looking at barriers and issues that you face in teaching climate change. And for this, we're going to get into small groups and go into the breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. We hear, of course, so much about climate change doubt, and I'm sure many of you still shake your heads at how this could even be in doubt anymore and why this discussion even exists. And we know the science is in, but yes, there are still doubters out there. And on one hand, some people say, well, we should just not entertain those discussions at all. The science is in. We know that we have to reduce carbon emissions and fast and significantly. Don't even listen to people who are doubting. But then there are other approaches, and a lot of this are from books like How to Talk About Climate Change and Don't Even Think About It. There are ways to have inclusive discussions that invite climate doubt. I think a really key point of this, however, is that inviting climate doubt into a discussion doesn't mean that you are encouraging climate doubt or forcing the conversation to get to a place where there is climate doubt. Again, the science is in. We know what the science is. The good thing about objective fact is there's no ideology, there's no opinion about it. The facts are what they are. So the idea is not to ignore the facts. But climate doubt does come from many different places. And there is a way to empathize. There are many ways to empathize with climate doubt. And a lot of it comes down to having these discussions and asking, where does it come from? And this is what I'd like you to look at in breakout groups is, where do you think some climate doubt comes from? And what do you think you can do to welcome this doubt in an open discussion where you still adhere to the facts? Climate change is real, it's exacerbated by humans, and we have to act quickly to decarbonize within the next 10 years. That's immovable. But can that exist while welcoming someone who is having doubts and trying to empathize and understand at least where they're coming from? That's what I'd like you to look at. So in terms of the groups, these are general categories. So for K to 3, we're going to go into room number 1, and I'll give instructions in just a moment about how we'll logistically go about getting into the rooms. For grades 4 to 6, you'll go in room 2. Middle school, grades 7, 8, you'll go into room 3. And then 9 to 12, the high school teachers, you can go into room 4. And an easy way to do this so that Ryan can quickly put everybody into the proper rooms is change your name to whichever room is most applicable to you. So I know at the beginning of the day, you were asked to change your name or invited to change your name to a different topic or creature in nature. So using that same process, just change your name either to 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on which age group you teach. And then we'll give about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms to discuss this question. How can you welcome climate doubt into an inclusive class discussion, but again, without veering off of the hard science for which there is no doubt about? What are some of the challenges of doing that? How can you do that? Discuss in your groups for about 10 minutes. We will then come back and do a debrief. What we can do is have one spokesperson from each group sort of summarize the main takeaways from your group's discussion, and then we'll have you turn your microphone on when we come back into the main virtual room here. And then after that,
hey, Ian, I just want to, we'd already established breakout rooms for 1, 2, and 3 for an afternoon session and put people in them. How do we go about, I guess I would just add more breakout rooms. So we've got breakout rooms 4. So let's just redo the numbering and I'll create more breakout rooms. How many do we need?
As long as that works. I mean, we could go with the current breakout rooms. Logistically, that might be easier. I mean,
okay, let's do that.
Why not avoid reinventing the wheel, and we'll just go with the existing breakout room. So you'll have a mix of age groups, but that's fine. No worries. So about 10 minutes, and then we'll meet back, debrief, follow up, and then Q&A.
think I got them all assigned.
Yeah, it's challenging in the aspect of, the students come into the classroom with the opinions of their parents, um, very strong political, generally, or religious viewpoints, and such as, just talking about um, genetics and changes over time and evolution and how you approach that. And you generally don't use the you really just talk about it as changes over time. Otherwise, there's so much pushback from it. And I think that in this sense, this would have to be approached in that same manner of, what does our climate look like right now, and what did it look like in the past, and where do we see it in our future, and how do we make changes if we don't go in wait if we don't go in this if we go in this direction, if we continue on in this direction, as I'm trying to say, then this is what our climate will look like. But if we make changes, this is direction. I mean, that's how I see it. Otherwise, you just get way too much pushback, not necessarily from the students, but really from the parents, which then feeds into the students, and then you get the pushback from the student.
Yeah. I agree. I think that language is a huge factor in it. I really liked how you said changes over time instead of evolution. And I think probably with climate change, it has to be the same, as we can't use the words climate change. But I liked that in one of the activities it said, what would it be like if it was hotter, or would it be like if it snowed more, or thinking about the temperature or the weather or the ways that it impacts you directly, instead of saying climate change or let's talk about global warming, or those like things that, you're right, parents really latch on to. And yeah, same thing. I used to teach music, and the kids would never care what songs we did. I would let them vote or pick them or things like that. And parents were the ones that had the issues with any songs. It was never the kids. Even the kids that were very religious, that they didn't care about the songs, but the parents did. And I think that's it, is we got to get the parents to believe in science in Douglas County.
The parents begin to think that I have a political agenda or an agenda. And my viewpoint, I never have I'm just teaching what's,
You're like, I don't get paid enough to indoctrinate people, okay?
Yeah, exactly. But so I walk that fine line. And I think this would be another of, walking that fine line. But I mean, I think it's important for students to have an understanding of what that would look like in the future if we stay on the same path or if we don't, and I don't think that's giving an agenda, because you're giving all the options of what things look like.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I found interesting about the presentation so far was the idea of creating positive attitudes towards learning about climate science, like the CO2 game and all that stuff. I thought that was a good thing to do, because I think that will kind of create interest in it early on. And at first, when he was talking about that, he presented that story about the swallowtail, And so, yes, climate change is great because we get swallowtails now. And that's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily supposed to be there. So I was kind of hesitant at that point, but then as he went on, it kind of got me on board with that idea.
Yeah, there are many similar games as such. You know, when in the past, when I've taught the carbon and oxygen cycle, there are, you know, games that take you outside where students are using their bodies to represent the, you know, the different atoms or different molecules. And it does have, you know, an impact on the students in terms of seeing numbers, you know, visualizing numbers, because it's difficult to visualize molecules and what they look like because we can't even visualize them really. But when there's a pack of students someplace, you know, and then they can visualize it that way, it's very helpful, very impactful.
I like the games too because kids can understand rules, and then when you teach them a game like that, you're teaching them the rules of nature and they don't even realize it, like the way that the carbon goes through. And I was like, I just learned all about that just from hearing about the game. I don't even need to play it, but the kids would absolutely love to play it and they would learn how that process works. And I like that. It's very digestible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to hear from people that have already begun to teach. You know, sitting on a variety of things that I do in the Portland area, it seems to be the students, I don't know if it's the students, I don't know if it's the parents, but more open to the learning of these different ideas. And so it's always interesting to hear, you know, what they're doing in the classroom. I haven't really heard so much about climate change and what they're doing in the classroom, but just other ideas. So it would be interesting to know, you know, how that's being received and, you know, exactly what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, and I think in Portland, so I went to Portland State, and when I was there, it was a huge initiative that they talked about sustainability and green practices and all of that stuff. It was a big deal for all of their programs. And so I wonder if it's a cultural thing more than just a familial thing, as they see that stuff in the prints that the ads that they get in the mail. They see that sustainability stuff on a regular basis, and so it's more normalized. And so when they see it in the classroom, it's not like climate change. It's like, oh, we're talking about greenhouse emissions and blah blah blah, stuff that they've heard about in their daily lives, versus maybe in Douglas County we just don't talk about it as much. I don't know.
Hey Jenny, welcome aboard.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what well, I mean, we could say it's political, or, you know,
Right.
or there's just a difference.
Yeah.
But irregardless, you know, it would be nice to see, you know, how they're approaching it, and
Oh, like in classroom, yeah.
and we could do a more gentle version.
Hey, we're just about done here. I'm going to send out a message, but Jenny, do you want to chime in here regarding the question?
I think you're...
Jenny, we can't hear you. I think you probably had your headphones plugged in.
Oh, you got your tech advisor.
No.
No.
That's okay. I think we're about done anyway. It's interesting to listen to you all.
Thanks,
we'll see you
Casey.
back in the group, but as my breakout session, it's all about the story and connecting people and getting people engaged. So I think Ian's kind of highlighted some of that. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait, I think it's working now.
Yeah, Jenny is working now.
Jenny had to bring in her technical expert to help with the sound. And
Yes. He's 12. He's the best in the house.
Yeah,
Excellent.
we got help from a 9-year-old the other day. So.
Yeah, this online learning, I don't know what we would do without the older siblings in the house.
All right, do we have everyone back, or are we still waiting for a few people?
I think everyone should be back. I blew up the rooms. So.
All right, good stuff. So there were 3 breakout rooms, correct?
Yes, the three breakout rooms. So.
Okay, so we'll go with one representative for each room. We'll start with room number 1 to just kind of debrief what was discussed in your breakout group, and we'll just kind of go down the list. Representative from group 1, then group 2, then group 3. We can open it up to a broader discussion, and I'd certainly be happy to take your questions. So representative for group number 1, you can unmute yourself and let us know what was discussed with regards to this question of how you can invite an inclusive discussion while adhering to the science.
I don't know which group I was in.
Well, you're group 1 now, so that'll
Okay.
work.
Well, then I'll talk, I guess. We didn't assign.
Sounds good.
We didn't assign anybody, but I'm happy to talk. We were just talking about how the idea of climate change, just using that word there would be a big pushback from it, and not necessarily from the students, but more from the parents, and how evolution needs to be approached not from the standpoint of evolution, but changes over time, and climate change would be the same, take that same approach of what that looks like for changes over time, and just how there would be a pushback on it unless we treaded the water in a more gentle way.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of how you might go about, I mean, this is the big question, of course. How do you tread the water in a more gentle way? Did that come up at all in the discussion?
Yeah, I think it was Aaron and Freddie. We were talking about playing games, and how playing such as Ian, that you showed the different one of the CO2 game in the sun, and how that tends to break down the walls and also allow students to visualize perhaps what's happening, such as the carbon and oxygen cycle, what's happening with the molecules, and just the game itself could break down the walls in that way, and see a direction of what's it going to look like if we keep going in the direction we're going, what's it going to look like if we make changes. So those are some ideas that we talked about.
All right, thank you very much. So our next group, unofficially group number 2, do we have a representative for our next group? All right, yeah, Brian, take it away.
Group number 2. Okay. So we broke it down into 2 different questions, like you asked, I believe. So first one, what's behind doubting the science in climate change? And then the second part, like, how do we welcome in doubt into our classroom? And I feel bad for our group because Cindy and I talk most of the time. So Cindy gave us, started off, we're thinking about what was behind it, and really that, aware that there's a vested industry to misinform and disinform, like what's been happening with climate for 30, 40, for decades, basically, and how that is really entrenched. And so how do we are able to open up people's thinking and realizing it. And so that led us to the second question, well, how do we welcome that down? And a really good example that like Cindy brought up was like parallel examples of different moments where misinformation and disinformation was used to sway public opinion. And so the cigarette industry was one of them. I was leading on my, again, like I enjoy history a lot. And so I listen to a lot of podcasts as like just, you know, my downtime. One of them is Revolutions by Mike Duncan. And he details, you know, all the major revolutions and how much conspiratorial thinking is at the bedrock of a lot of movements and a lot of time period. How, you know, what was now we know is objective truth was not at the time period, and people were worked up in a frenzy about it. And so using those parallel examples to our students can be kind of removed from maybe the emotions around climate change. They kind of work through the scientific process or an historical thinking process to like understand, you know, how valuable those but those are to figuring out to be a critical thinker. I think that was what we kind of led on to. So more on the analytical side of how do we welcome it in, and really going back to how do we help our students thinking about misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, and there's certainly some great resources online and I'm sure in text as well about finding misinformation and the term that I think we're hearing a lot more about now, disinformation, the deliberate twisting of truths.
Add on that, Ian?
Yeah.
I've got a feedback on your game to say human planting trees. That's not actually the greatest thing to do so for that to be a CO2 exchange, that creates a lot of misinformation, and you and I can talk about that later.
Oh, for sure. And was that in which activity in particular?
That was in the activity on the circles of the carbon and molecules and the sunbeams. And then you have those action cards. And one of the action cards was human plant trees. And then that actually makes it better, right? There's less, somehow there's less CO2 because of that. And that's not exactly true. And so we have to really get that science down. And so there's some real key science in that now that we need to do that we need to know, because it'll create a misconception. And that's why I say that.
For sure. And you know, I really appreciate you bringing that up. And this is something that's, as you say, it's come out a lot more, is the kind of the myth of carbon offsets. And that could open up any number of additional activities. And that's certainly something we'll look to update in the next reprint of the book, because there's a lot more science. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because you're absolutely right. Well-intentioned misinformation is certainly out there too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how that could be used to like undermine what,
Yeah, and we hear that in Canada. People say, well, you know, we've got the boreal forest, so Canada's carbon neutral. It's like, well, it doesn't work that way, actually. And I mean, that's a whole other discussion. Certainly brings into the systems thinking for sure. One strategy that is sometimes used that's been shown to be quite ineffective is the idea of a one side versus another side debate. You know, is climate change caused by humans or not? And that entertains an aspect of the discussion that really isn't representative. And I don't know if any of you have seen the clip from This Week Tonight with John Oliver about the statistically representative climate change debate. We always seem to see Bill Nye debating somebody else, from somebody who works for Rupert Murdoch in most cases, or ExxonMobil. And why isn't it 97 people talking to 3 people? That would be more statistically representative for a debate. So debates are shown to be pretty ineffective, because it's not as though anyone is split on this. And it validates the notion that we're split on this by saying, all right, you're on team A, you're on team B. So it's totally unrepresentative of the real situation. So all good discussion. So let's move on to our final group here, a representative from that group, to share what came up in your breakout room.
I'm going to have someone else from the group do it because I have done this before.
Sounds good.
So many of the things have already been addressed, and a couple things we just brought up was a lot of times misconceptions or things happen and the discussion goes sideways when we don't have the same vocabulary. And really defining our vocabulary helps. I think leading with empathy, which you mentioned earlier, we discussed that. The difficulty with so many families in our community whose livelihoods depend on industries that are not always friendly and require some significant change. So compromising, I'm trying to think of other things that were brought up in the group discussion. I think all those are important. I really like what you just said about the debate, because we did talk about having other voices, or just allowing or being empathetic to people who are skeptical, and that skepticism is good because it makes us look into see how rigorous our arguments are, and that's our, I guess, our not arguments, but how rigorous our facts are. So I think all those lead to good discussions, and I think when people feel respected, they're much more open to looking at your ideas or looking at the facts in a new way. We also just mentioned about the vaccine issue, which is, you know, the conspiracy facts in that, and that there was a recent study group that found the two facts that move people the furthest was 95% of doctors are getting the vaccine, and that no one's died from the vaccine, but people have died from COVID. So I think finding those key things that can move people, because it is an emotional issue, not just a fact issue, were kind of the highlights of our discussion.
Yeah, leading with that empathy is so key. And if you really read in depth about this, and you know, George Marshall's book, Why People Are Wired or Hardwired to Not Believe in Climate Change, in a lot of cases, the research reveals that there are very few people like the Rupert Murdochs and Koch brothers and ExxonMobil executives of the world, at least in those of yesteryear. There aren't that many people in terms of the proportion of the full population who are deliberately out to mess things up. A lot of people are impacted by the messages that are pushed by the ExxonMobils and so on, but most people are coming at it from a vulnerable, insecure place, and they're coming from a place of fear. They're not coming from a place of, I want to cause trouble and I want to cause misery for others. And I know that what might benefit me short term is going to hurt other people. Most people aren't wired that way either. And if somebody, for example, works in the petroleum industry, or their parents work in the petroleum industry, and they say, you know, I don't want to be out of a job, or I don't want my parents to be out of a job, that's something that we can all agree on. So, well, I certainly wouldn't want to be out of a job either. And I really hope that your family isn't impacted by anyone being out of a job. Now, that can then lead into a discussion about how the growth projections of industry are much higher in renewable energy than they are in fossil fuels. And for older students, talking about pension plans, I mean, a lot of pension plans are carbon rich, although there are more diversified options now. But a lot of these pension funds are based on the price of natural resources like oil staying the same for the next 30 or 40 years, when we know that that is not going to be the case, because the supply chain and the demand is going to change. Investments in renewable technology come time for retirement in 20, 30, 40 years for many people. Those are going to have a lot more monetary value than fossil fuel related investments. So with older students who can understand those concepts a bit more in depth, that's a really interesting discussion you can have. And then again, you find some common ground where people say, wow, you know, that, I mean, I want to have a good investment fund and a good solid retirement. And if renewable energy is going to help me do that, well, that's definitely in my best interest. So there are lots of interesting opportunities, and it's just finding that common ground and you know, as you mentioned, treating people with respect, because I think we all have a tendency to speak with our limbic system, our reptile brain, when we're up against something that might threaten our immediate livelihood. And that's natural and that's totally understandable. And it's something that we can work with for sure. So I know we're almost out of time. We've timed this out actually quite nicely. Are there any additional questions before we finish off? And thank you again for all the groups for your discussion and for the representatives for sharing your thoughts. Certainly a discussion that we could have long into the day, but I know you have a busy schedule. So I'll take any additional thoughts or questions that you may have. Just in the meantime, for more information just about Green Teacher and Green Teacher resources, greenteacher.com, fairly easy to remember, and you can email me at ian@greenteacher.com. Actually, our next issue of the magazine goes live next week. We've got a preview of it up on our website. We always have 2 free articles per issue, and those are up on the website if you'd like to take a look. And the last issue, or the latest episode of our podcast, which went live next week, I was talking with a couple gentlemen who are with a new organization based in teaching environmental education through animation and comic books. And they had some really interesting insights about dealing with pushback. And we talked a lot about the pushback playbook for climate change, and you can certainly read a lot about that in Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt. But one of the classic things, and we all see it, when somebody with a vested interest in fossil fuels knows that the evidence is overwhelming and they can't, quote unquote, win the debate, one of the sort of lateral tactics that we see so much is, well, you're being preachy and you're being condescending, and oh, here comes another holier than thou, you know, guilt-inducing person from their ivory tower. I mean, you can see it coming a mile away, or 1.6 kilometers away if you're in Canada. You know it's coming. If the evidence is overwhelming, you have to go somewhere else if you're still trying to push that narrative. And they had a really interesting approach to that, where one of the characters in the comic book, it was a talking tree, anthropomorphized, but the tree at one point was like, oh, here comes another lecture. And that generated a discussion with one of the other characters in the little comic strip about how, well, I'm not actually trying to be preachy. This is something that's in everybody's best interests. And they had some really interesting perspectives on the notion of pushback. So the podcast is Talking with Green Teachers. It's fully open source, and you can find it on all the regular podcast platforms, all the Spotify's and Google and Apple and iTunes and Audible and all those places. So check that out. How do you teach environmental ed and deal with pushback to climate change through comic books? Kind of cool.
Say, Ian, this is Casey. I'm with Umpqua Watershed. We're the ones that sponsoring it. Of course, Ryan.
I like your shirt.
Thank you. So we have a radio station that we play music on during the day, but we do environmental education on the weekends. And we're starting a climate show starting out in April. And I was wondering, would you be willing to be an interviewee for the show?
I'd be delighted, yeah. Cross-pollination of broadcasts or podcasts is what we're all about. I mean, as I say, it's open source, so the more the better.
Good. So
yeah,
we'll look into it and I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great job. This is fantastic. I'm doing a little breakout session on the storytelling in environmental education, how to get people engaged, and a lot of what you talked about really hit on that.
Yeah, you know, my background is in nature and heritage interpretation from my background with parks, and that's what it's all about. The story is the thing, and how do you engage people's emotions? I mean, some people are interested in facts about beetles or facts about glacial features, but the majority of people are engaged through stories, or engaged through their emotions, and the path to the emotions is often through stories. So yeah,
so
very much.
Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Oh, it was my pleasure. You know, when things open up, my wife and I love the Pacific Northwest, and we dream of one day doing a trip all the way down from southern British Columbia right down to Baja. not going to happen in the near future with the border still closed, but someday.
Well, you got to stop in the Umpqua. You've got places to stay. We'd love to host you guys.
Well, that would be delightful. And I love measuring land through watersheds. If I could redraw all the boundaries, it would just, there wouldn't even be boundaries, but just allotments of where people live would all be based on watersheds. I consider myself a resident of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed. So people in New York and Eastern Manitoba, Ohio, they're as much part of my home as people who live right next door. So
Well done.
So
Keep shining.
Thank you everyone for being part of this experience, and I hope the rest of the day continues to go well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ian, for being here. And yeah, I'm excited that we were able to give books from Green Teacher. Not the climate change ones necessarily, but it's still a lot of wonderful, phenomenal activities that I've used in my classroom too. So for all of you teachers, if you haven't had a chance to look through those, there's some really great information in there. Yeah, just a great organization. So yeah, thank you so much for being with us today, Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for reaching out and making this happen. A big credit to Ryan for putting the feelers out and getting us all here today.
Awesome. Yeah, so we actually are going into a break now, like just a break. I know we've had a lot of different things, different types of presentations, different lengths of presentations. So like some interactive, some not. So we're going to be taking a break now. So Casey, I'm going to have you stop the recording for now.